Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into something strange. Imagine wandering through a medieval street market, dirt under your boots, bells jingling in the distance, and everywhere you look, people wrapped in fabrics that range from drab sacks to glorious peacock-level ridiculousness. And no, that man isn't wearing a wizard hat. He's just trying to impress the noblewoman next door. We're talking fashion, but not the kind you scroll past on Instagram. This is the kind where your hat could poke someone's eye out, your sleeves could double as picnic blankets, and wearing the wrong color might get you arrested. Medieval fashion wasn't just weird, it was serious business. And trust me, if you were dropped into the 14th century right now, you wouldn't last 5 minutes before someone accused you of being a heretic or worse, a fashion disaster. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far this sleepy little caravan travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking, slowly, through the main thoroughfare of a medieval town. It's evening, candles flicker in windows, and you can smell smoke, stew, and just a hint of something awful that might be the communal trench latrine down the road. But your focus is elsewhere. You're staring, gawking really, at the people. Their clothes look like a fever dream designed by someone who had never seen a human body before. That man over there? He's wearing a tunic so short it looks like a shirt he outgrew 3 years ago, with hose, basically 2 long fabric tubes, one for each leg, tied to a belt. And he's strutting like a peacock. Nearby, a woman's headdress rises 2 feet above her skull in a perfect cone, held in place by sorcery, apparently. You're not alone in being confused. Even historians today still debate what some of these garments were actually for. Some believe fashion was dictated by climate or practicality. Others argue it was purely social signaling, because nothing screams wealth like a gown with a 10-foot train dragging through mud and horse poop. Now, you might be wondering, how did we get here? What made medieval people dress like Renaissance cosplayers who'd lost a bet? To understand that, you have to step back, way back, into what people call the Dark Ages. Spoiler, it wasn't pitch black, but it was definitely dim when it came to personal hygiene and outfit coordination. Clothing in the early Middle Ages was, well, uninspired. Most people wore simple tunics made from rough wool or linen. Picture a sack with a hole for your head and maybe some sleeves if you were lucky. Belts were essential, not just for holding things up, but also because pockets hadn't been invented yet. If you wanted to carry something, you tied it to yourself like a medieval Batman utility belt. But things started to change in the 12th and 13th centuries. Trade routes opened up, especially with the Byzantine Empire and Islamic world. Suddenly, Europeans got a peek at silk, cotton, and a little something called color. Up until then, most clothing came in nature's greatest hits, beige, brown, and is that mildew, gray. But dyes brought blues, greens, and even that holy grail of pigments, crimson. And here's a fun fact you didn't ask for: crimson dye came from crushed insects. Specifically, a bug called the kermes. Tiny. Expensive. So, if someone walks past you dripping in crimson, you're basically looking at a walking bug graveyard. Chic, right? Meanwhile, sumptuary laws began to take hold. These were literal fashion laws that told you what you could and couldn't wear based on your class. Think of it as the Middle Ages way of saying, no, Karen, you can't wear ermine trim unless you're married to a duke. Violating these laws could lead to fines, public shaming, or worse, people thinking you were nouveau riche. So if you're a tailor during this time, you're either terrified or thriving. Clothing becomes a status game. The longer your sleeves, the higher your hat, the more absurd your silhouette, the more powerful you must be. Nobody cared if you could run, breathe, or sit. Functionality was for peasants. Of course, if you were a peasant, your wardrobe didn't evolve much. Well, tunic. Maybe some leather shoes if you were lucky. And underwear? Let's just say it wasn't standard issue. Many went without. Which, considering how rarely people washed, might not have been such a terrible idea. Wash day was less self-care Sunday, and more pray nothing freezes off. Speaking of cleanliness, here's another delightful tidbit. Some wealthier folks used urine to bleach their linen. Human pee. And then wore it proudly. Because nothing says noble blood like slightly lemony trousers. Still, even the poor knew how to add flair. Embroidered cuffs, belts with carved buckles, hats made from straw or felt. And if someone really wanted to get noticed, they'd turn their tunic inside out so the seams showed, and act so rebellious it was basically the medieval equivalent of flipping someone off. But don't get too comfortable yet. We haven't even gotten to the truly weird fashion statements. Like codpieces. Or shoes so long they needed chains to tie them to your knees. Or the bizarre practice of plucking your hairline to make your forehead look more divine. A high forehead was sexy once. Just not anymore. So here you are, in the middle of this wild street, watching humans try to out-peacock each other in itchy fabrics, headgear that defies physics, and shoes that seem purpose-built for tripping over your goat. And you think, wow, I could never survive this. But the night's still young. And we haven't even touched the hats yet. You're still standing there, marveling at the chaos of cloth, when something glimmers in the corner of your eye. It's not a jewel, or at least not a proper one. It's a bolt of fabric being carried like it's the crown jewels, tucked under a merchant's arm like he's afraid it'll float away. And in a way it could. It's silk. Pure, exotic, glimmering silk. And in medieval Europe, that stuff was practically magic. See, if you thought designer brands today were expensive, try buying imported fabric in the 1300s. You'd need coin, land, titles, or be willing to marry someone with all three. Silk wasn't just rare. It was legendary. Rumors spread that it came from far-off lands, spun by fairy insects or harvested from glowing trees. The truth was only slightly less mythical. It came from silkworms in China and the Middle East. But getting it here? That meant caravans, sea routes, and a whole lot of very rich people elbowing each other to get a piece. You watch the merchant unfold a sample for a lady in deep green velvet, also rare by the way, and she runs her fingers across the surface like it's holy. In a way it was. Silk didn't just look expensive, it felt expensive. It was soft, smooth, and did that slinky shimmer thing that makes even simple movements look like dancing. No wonder people were obsessed. But not all silk was equal. There were grades, some light and ethereal, some dense and stiff enough to stand on their own. Some silks were so finely woven, you could pull the whole bolt through a ring. Others were embroidered with gold threads so heavy they could practically knock someone out. Both types were wildly out of reach for the average person, of course. You'd be lucky to afford the wrapper it came in. That's why most people, rich or poor, lived and died in wool. Don't underestimate wool, though. It was the workhorse of medieval fashion, versatile, warm, and surprisingly stylish if treated right. It could be dyed, woven fine, or felted thick. And if you really wanted to flaunt, you went for the brightly dyed stuff. Dyes were an entire economy on their own. Take blue, for example. That lovely cornflower or deep navy that came from woad. It smelled terrible during processing, turned your hands blue for days, and was sometimes grown under royal monopoly. Red came from madder root, or if you were royalty, the aforementioned murdered bug dye, kermes. Yellow came from weld, a plant that smells a bit like old salad, but gave off a sunny, radiant hue. These weren't just colors. They were statements. And they had prices to match. A merchant might spend more on a bolt of dyed fabric than on a small cottage. In fact, cloth was so valuable it was often used as currency. Literally. You could pay taxes in wool. Some nobles even gave cloth as dowries or inheritances. Forget gold bars. Give me 6 ells of fine Flemish linen and we'll call it even. Speaking of linen, let's take a moment to appreciate the other half of medieval fabric duopoly. Linen was made from flax, a plant you had to soak, beat, and comb until it gave you thread. The process was long, boring, and smelled like a swamp. But the result? Breathable, light, and a gift from the gods during a European summer when everything else felt like wearing a hot rug. Linen was usually used for undergarments and shirts. Which, by the way, didn't mean underpants. It meant the layer between your itchy wool tunic and your tender skin. It was the unsung hero of medieval life, something you changed more often, washed more frequently, a relative term, and wore until it practically dissolved. And now for your bizarre but true fashion fact of the night. Rich folks sometimes bleach their linen using stale urine. Human urine. It contains ammonia, which helped whiten the fabric. People actually collected pee in jars. Some towns even had pee taxes. There were jobs based entirely on fetching, fermenting, and applying urine to clothes. And you thought modern influencers had strange careers. Anyway, as you trail the fabric merchant into a stall lined with shimmering bolts, you notice something else, something curious. The shape of the clothes is starting to change. Gone are the sack-like tunics and shapeless cloaks of earlier centuries. We've got structure. We've got draping. We've got what might generously be called tailoring. This is when clothing starts to flirt with the human body instead of just hiding it. Sleeves get narrower. Waists get cinched. Necklines, gasp, start to drop, especially for women of status. And it's all thanks to fabric getting cheaper and tailoring getting sharper. By the 14th century, you weren't just dressing for warmth anymore. You were dressing to slay. But that slay came at a cost. And sometimes a deadly one. Because to get those deep, luxurious colors and those shimmering textures, you needed chemicals. Toxic ones. Lead for white. Mercury for red. Arsenic for green. You know, all the stuff you definitely shouldn't rub all over your skin every day for decades. But people did. And they looked fabulous while doing it. Historians still debate just how aware medieval folks were of the dangers. Some think they knew but shrugged it off. Others argue they thought the side effects, pale skin, hair loss, tremors, looked good. And hey, that's not so different from modern fashion either. Ever worn shoes that felt like medieval torture devices? Exactly. By now, your eyes are adjusting to the swirl of fabrics and the weight of all these unspoken rules. You're starting to see it, not just the clothes themselves, but what they say. Who has power? Who has money? Who wants both? That man in dusty brown? Probably a craftsman. The woman in soft gray with tiny embroidery at the cuffs? A merchant's wife. And the boy in blue velvet with sleeves so long they brushed the floor? He's either a lord's son, or someone with very, very bold laundry habits. The street is dimming now. Lanterns flicker. The day is ending. But your journey? It's only beginning. Tomorrow, you'll learn why tall hats became the next fashion arms race. You wake the next morning, or at least the medieval version of morning, which is more of a slow emergence into gray daylight after the church bells scream you out of your straw mattress. You stretch, groan, and immediately hit your head on a wooden beam. Fashion may be evolving, but ceilings haven't gotten the memo. You step outside, bleary-eyed, into the town square, and stop cold. Your jaw hangs open, not because someone's wearing their tunic backwards again, but because floating above the crowd like miniature towers of Babel are hats. Enormous hats. Terrifyingly tall hats. You're not dreaming. Someone just walked by with a 2-foot cone strapped to their skull, and it's somehow staying upright. Welcome to the golden age of the hennin. Yes, that's its real name. No, it's not a weapon. But it might as well be. These towering conical hats, often wrapped in gauzy veils and perched at improbable angles, were all the rage for aristocratic women in the 15th century. The taller the hennin, the closer to, well, not God, but definitely court prestige. Some were so tall they had to be braced from the inside with wire. Others were sewn to the headpiece so tightly it was like wearing a skyscraper made of linen and hope. And why, you ask? Why would someone willingly balance a traffic cone on their head for hours at a time? The answer, as always, is status. You didn't wear a hennin to go unnoticed. You wore it to be seen, from across the room, across the courtyard, across the kingdom, if you could help it. The hat didn't just say, "I'm noble." It screamed, "My family owns at least 3 castles and I haven't lifted a bucket in years." Of course, you couldn't wear one of these things and just go about your day. The hennin fundamentally changed how people moved. Doors had to be ducked. Carts had to be avoided. Out of the question. Riding a horse? Dangerous. Dancing? Only with significant headroom and a lot of practice. Wearing one was a performance, And like all fashion statements, it demanded commitment. You trail behind a woman now, her hennin swaying slightly as she walks. A long veil cascades from the tip, trailing behind her like a whisper. She's wearing a sideless gown too, a dress so open at the sides it looks like it was designed by someone with a deep hatred for modesty and sleeves. Her belt, hanging low at the hips, swings with a kind of calculated elegance that says, "I don't do manual labor. Ever." That's part of the whole look. The less practical the outfit, the higher your social rank must be. A milkmaid can't wear a hennin, she's busy surviving. But a duchess? She doesn't need to carry things. She has people for that. Her dress can drag. Her headpiece can poke birds out of the sky. It's fine. And yes, before you ask, people made fun of these hats even then. Satirical poems, woodcuts, and even church sermons ridiculed the hennin and its wearers. Clerics warned it was vanity incarnate. Moralists claimed the tall hats were symbols of pride and spiritual decay. And yet, the trend persisted. Because, as you've probably noticed, telling rich people not to wear ridiculous things has never worked. Historians still debate the hennin's origins. Some believe it was inspired by the Mongol headdresses seen by European travelers. Others point to Islamic court fashion as a possible influence. One theory even suggests it evolved from the pointy hoods of Burgundian court dress, stretched to absurd lengths over time. As usual, the real answer is probably a mix of all three. Fashion, like soup, gets weird when you throw too many cultures in the pot. But not everyone went for the towering cone. Variants emerged, like the butterfly hennin, with two veils fanned out like wings, or the heart-shaped escoffion, which looked like your head had grown horns of braided hair. These shapes weren't just stylish, they were competitive. Every noblewoman wanted her hat to be just a little more unique, a little more gravity-defying than the next. You might say it was the Middle Ages answer to Instagram filters. You pause at a well, where a group of women are gossiping, clucking softly like hens in a silk coop. Each wears a variation of the hennin, though one is clearly the leader. Her veil is sheerest, her cone tallest, her gown studded with little glass beads that wink at the morning light. She doesn't speak much, she doesn't have to. Her outfit does all the talking. You, meanwhile, are still struggling to understand how the physics work. You're half convinced there's a hidden rod down her spine keeping everything in place. You wouldn't be wrong. The overall effect is mesmerizing and mildly terrifying, like watching someone balance a fine porcelain vase on their forehead while pretending nothing's unusual. Then comes the punchline. Men had their own version of this nonsense too. Oh yes. You thought this was just a female fashion competition? Please. The men of the late Middle Ages said, "Hold my mead," and invented the huppeland, a robe with sleeves so wide they could double as curtains. Some versions had shoulders so padded you'd think medieval men invented football. And don't even get started on the hats. Double-rolled brims, feathers as long as broom handles, and, eventually, the chaperon, which was essentially a hood turned into a hat, twisted in ways no hood was ever meant to twist. And just like with hennins, the more ridiculous your male outfit, the more important you were pretending to be. If your sleeves dragged, your hat blocked sunlight for nearby villagers, and your beard was waxed into points, congrats, you're ready for court. What's funny is how utterly impractical it all was. You can't farm in a hennin. You can't bake bread in a huppeland. These clothes were designed not to do things, but to show that you didn't have to. That's the thread running through medieval fashion. The more useless your clothes are, the more useful your life must be. So as the morning mist lifts and the market square fills, you realize you're not just witnessing fashion. You're seeing a language, a visual code of power, wealth, gender, and absurdity. And if that doesn't make you appreciate your stretchy pajama pants, I don't know what will. You've barely recovered from the hat parade when you turn a corner and are immediately assaulted by an entirely different kind of fashion statement, one that hugs places it probably shouldn't. Tight, shiny, suspiciously revealing. It's like someone took two velvet leeches and stuck them on their legs. You've just laid eyes on the legendary chausse, medieval men's leggings. And no, you're not imagining things. They're basically tights. Medieval tights. At first, you think maybe he's a dancer, or possibly some kind of street performer. But no, this man is a knight, a noble, a land-owning aristocrat. And he is rocking a pair of hosiery so snug they look painted on. You can't look away. Partly from shock. Mostly from concern. See, chausse weren't pants in the modern sense. They were leg coverings made of wool or sometimes silk if you had serious coin. Originally, they were separate, one for each leg, held up with laces, or more commonly, attached to a belt or to the undertunic via a complex crisscross of ties that practically required an engineering degree. You wonder how long it took to get dressed in these things. 10 minutes? 20? A team of helpers? Because there's no way anyone's hopping into those alone. Not without a few pulled muscles and a strong will to suffer for style. Why so tight though? Well, in theory, it helped with mobility. Tighter fabric didn't flap or catch on things. But let's be honest, at some point it stopped being about function and became a full-blown medieval peacock strut. The men wanted to show off their legs. Specifically, their calves, which were the 14th century equivalent of a six-pack. Thick, shapely calves were a symbol of virility, nobility, and very good horse-riding thighs. But where there are tights, there are also problems. Like modesty. Because once fashion started showing the natural shape of the male form, things got awkward. Enter the codpiece. Yes, the codpiece. A padded, often decorative flap attached to the front of the hose to cover the business zone. At first, it was just a practical solution. When hose became tighter and shorter, something had to cover the gap. But it didn't stay practical for long. You're about to see a man walk by with a codpiece so enormous it looks like he's smuggling a fruit basket. Some were pointed. Some were rounded. Some were decorated with embroidery or even tiny buttons. And some, historians still shudder at this, were stuffed to appear more impressive. You glance at one particularly ambitious codpiece and wonder if he can even sit down without knocking over a candle. Naturally, this led to its fair share of scandal. Church leaders condemned it as lewd. Moralists clutched their pearls. And yet, it remained wildly popular for nearly a century. Because, let's be honest, when has public disapproval ever stopped men from doing something ridiculous? But let's back up for a second. Before the codpiece became the banana hammock of medieval Europe, chausse had already been around for centuries. Early versions were looser and worn mostly for warmth and protection, especially under armor. Knights wore them beneath chainmail. Peasants wore them with tunics. But by the 14th century, thanks to new tailoring techniques and finer fabrics, they got tighter and tighter and tighter. Which brings us back to the man currently trying to gracefully cross the muddy street without splitting a seam. He's wearing a doublet, a short, padded jacket, tied directly to his hose. That's right, his pants are literally tethered to his shirt. If one tie breaks, he's risking full medieval moonlight. And while we're here, fun fact, not everyone wore undergarments beneath their hose. Linen brays, basically baggy boxer shorts, were common for a while, but the fashion elite began to abandon them. Because they ruined the silhouette. And nothing gets between a fashionista and his perfect leg line. Also, washing linen was a pain, and let's be real, bathing wasn't exactly a daily ritual. You may ask, didn't this all chafe? Didn't it itch? Didn't it make horseback riding extremely awkward? Absolutely. And yet, the look persisted. Historians still debate why men embraced such a revealing, uncomfortable look. Some say it was about showing virility. Others point to the rise of tailoring. Suddenly, clothing could be shaped to the body, so it was. And some, more cynically, think it was pure competition. If the guy next to you looked like a marble statue in wool, you weren't about to show up in saggy breeches. Still, not everyone played this game. Clerics, scholars, older noblemen, they stuck to robes. Long, flowy, voluminous robes. Because dignity, apparently, was more important than showing off your thighs. But the younger crowd? The trend-chasing, horn-blaring, velvet-sniffing court boys? They went all in. And there were consequences. In 1463, England passed a law regulating the length of the doublet and the tightness of hose. Tailors were warned. Codpieces were side-eyed. But again, it didn't stop the madness. By the end of the 15th century, men's fashion had become an arms race of thigh and groin display that makes skinny jeans look like cargo pants. You look around now and realize, this isn't just fashion. It's theater. Every outfit is a role. Every man strutting down the street in a doublet and hose is playing a character: the knight, the lover, the rich uncle who fought in the Crusades. Clothes were storytelling, and the story they told was usually, I have money, I have influence, and I definitely don't do physical labor. You shift your gaze down to your own hypothetical shows. Let's be honest, they wouldn't be flattering. But you admire the commitment, the absurdity, the sheer, unrelenting discomfort of it all. Because if you were a man in the late Middle Ages and you wanted to climb the social ladder, you'd have to start by squeezing into hose so tight they could double as tourniquets. And just think, we haven't even reached the shoes yet. You're still trying to mentally unsee the codpiece parade when something even more absurd catches your eye. It's not a hat this time. It's not hose. The shoes. Shoes so long and pointed, they curve upward like the tusk of a very stylish narwhal. One man's toes point almost a full foot ahead of him. Another has little bells attached to the tips, jingling with every dainty step. You don't know whether to laugh or offer assistance. Congratulations. You've officially entered the age of the polaine, the medieval shoe that made every cobblestone a tripping hazard. The name polaine comes from Poland, actually. These shoes were said to originate there, though of course, fashion spreads faster than a plague if nobles think it looks cool. By the 14th century, polaines had taken over courts from Paris to Prague. And the length? Completely out of hand. Or rather, out of foot. Some toes were so exaggerated, they had to be stuffed with moss or whalebone to keep their shape. Others were tied to the knees with little chains to stop the ends from flopping around like medieval clown shoes. Which, if you're wondering, made stairs a nightmare and running entirely theoretical. The longer the toe, the higher the status. A short polaine? You're probably just a respectable merchant. A modestly long one? Maybe minor nobility. But a 3-foot-long shoe that needs structural reinforcement and its own support team? Now that was a duke's foot. And yes, sumptuary laws tried to stop it. King Edward IV of England got so fed up with noblemen turning their feet into jousting lances that he literally outlawed shoes with points longer than 2 inches. Which, of course, only made people want longer ones. You're watching a man try to walk in polaines while also managing his long, sweeping gown, an outfit clearly designed for looks and not for daily activities. He's got to step high with every pace, lest he impale a passing goose or get his toes tangled in a puddle. But he looks fabulous, and isn't that what counts? Right beside him, a woman moves past like a ship in full sail. Her gown, possibly velvet, possibly her entire net worth, is trailing behind her like she's the final float in a royal parade. It's so long, it sweeps the dust from the street as she walks. Not that she notices. She has a servant behind her, carefully lifting the fabric away from mud and manure. That's not a luxury, it's necessary. These dresses were called trains, and they weren't just a fashion statement. They were a billboard. A silky, embroidered, incredibly impractical sign that said, I don't do chores. Ever. Trains could be several feet long. Some were detachable for practicality, read, dancing or emergency escapes, while others were sewn directly into the garment, because if you're going to commit to absurdity, you commit. Women of high status would often drape the fabric over one arm while walking indoors, or have servants fluff and arrange it behind them like peacocks arranging tail feathers. It was both art and armor, a soft wall that reminded everyone how untouchable you were. You might be wondering how people afforded all this cloth. Remember, fabric was expensive. Very expensive. So wearing a train was quite literally dragging your wealth behind you. The longer it was, the more you were flaunting your power and your ability to replace it if it got ruined. The irony, of course, is that no one walked faster than a funeral procession while wearing these things. You can't hustle in 6 feet of velvet. And that was the point. Speed was peasant behavior. Nobility moved slowly. They glided. They paused in doorways and made you wait. Even their shoes forced them to take smaller steps. It wasn't a bug, it was a feature. And when they really wanted to dial up the drama, They added dangling sleeves. Yes, sleeves. That dragged the ground. Sometimes they were so wide and long, they were tied up with ribbons just to keep them from knocking over candles or dragging through soup. These weren't garments anymore. They were obstacles. Beautiful, fluttering obstacles. It's around now you start to realize, medieval fashion wasn't about expressing individuality. It was about expressing rank. Clothes weren't for you. They were for everyone else to read. The right length of sleeve? Says you're married. A certain color? Says you're part of a noble house. Fur trim? Says you're rich and warm. Even the shape of your neckline could signal if you were a widow, a virgin, or someone you shouldn't talk to without a chaperone. And the rules weren't universal either. Each region, each century, each royal court had its own code. So wearing the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong place? Social suicide. Imagine showing up to a feast in a green tunic trimmed in squirrel fur, only to learn that's what bakers wear on feast days in this duchy. Congratulations, you just demoted yourself. And don't think the peasants were totally removed from this circus. Sure, they weren't wearing polaines or velvet gowns, but they paid attention. They imitated where they could, using dye substitutes, hand-me-downs, or clever alterations. A village girl might embroider her apron with a pattern seen at court. A blacksmith might have a Sunday tunic dyed with berries to mimic noble purple, even if it only lasted 3 washes. Fashion, after all, is contagious, even when it's attached to your knees with tiny chains. And so you stand there, watching a parade of noblemen waddling in beak-like shoes and noblewomen dragging entire tapestries behind them, and you can't help but laugh. Because somewhere between the bells on the toe tips and the servant dragging the train, you realize, nobody here is comfortable. But they look incredible. You've seen enough long shoes and floor-sweeping dresses to understand that medieval people were fully committed to suffering for fashion. But just when you think it can't get any weirder, you catch a glimpse of a noblewoman lifting her veil, and you freeze. Her face is porcelain white. Not pale, but her skin looks dusted in flour, her eyebrows are practically non-existent, and her forehead? So high it could host a small sundial. You didn't stumble into a ghost story, though it does feel like one. This is beauty, medieval style. Because in the Middle Ages, the pinnacle of feminine beauty wasn't rosy cheeks or a sun-kissed glow. It was skin so pale, so bloodless, you looked like you hadn't seen daylight since the fall of Rome. But because pale skin meant wealth. It meant you didn't work in the fields, didn't labor under the sun, didn't sweat, honestly, didn't do much of anything. You were an indoor creature. A delicate flower. A valuable possession to be kept out of the light. And to achieve that look, people went to terrifying lengths. The woman before you is likely wearing ceruse, a lead-based white pigment mixed with vinegar and applied like foundation. As in poison. As in, will eventually kill you, but you'll look flawless doing it. Ceruse covered blemishes, lightened the skin, and gave a chalky, matte finish that was all the rage among noble ladies who wanted to look like fancy ghosts. And if that wasn't dangerous enough, many women followed up with a red lip stain made from, you guessed it, mercury sulfide. Lipstick that could eat away at your mouth over time. But hey, beauty is pain, and possibly organ failure. Even more bizarre? To make their foreheads appear taller, some women shaved the front of their hairlines. Not just the baby hairs. Actual scalp. Tweezed or shaved clean for that elegant 5-head effect. Eyebrows? Also optional. Thin, pale, or plucked entirely. Eyelashes? Sometimes gone too. A bare, shining canvas. That was the ideal. You glance again at the woman. Her cheeks are blushed with a faint red, possibly from actual rouge, or possibly from irritation caused by rubbing cut lemons or vinegar into the skin to bleach it further. That was another beauty trick, natural acids used as toners. The sting was part of the process. And then there's the eyeliner. Not always black, sometimes green or blue, made from ground minerals. Applied with a tiny stick, carefully, as if not poking your own eye was a luxury few could afford. Eyes were meant to be large, doe-like, and slightly melancholy. It was all about appearing fragile and untouchable, like a slightly haunted painting that had wandered off the wall. Now, not everyone had access to imported cosmetics or the leisure to sit still for 2 hours of daily application. So for the working class, they got creative. Some used flour for powder, beet juice for rouge, burnt almonds for eyeliner, egg whites for a shiny serum effect. It was medieval DIY skincare before it was cool and before it was remotely safe. And the smell? Well, friend, you may think these beauty concoctions smelled faintly of roses and lavender, but many included animal fat, vinegar, old wine, eggs, and sometimes even urine. Again with the urine, medieval beauty was not for the faint of heart or the sensitive of nose. Still, to those wearing it, this wasn't vanity. It was survival. Appearance meant social standing, marriage prospects, family honor. A woman's face was her resume, her portfolio, her entire LinkedIn in lead-based paste. Men, of course, weren't immune to appearance-based expectations. While they weren't powdering themselves ghost white, at least not most of them, they were expected to stay clean-shaven, unless religious or knightly orders required beards, have well-kept hair, and dress with as much elegance as possible. Smelling decent helped too, thus the growing popularity of pomanders, little scented balls hung from belts to ward off bad smells and bad spirits. Mostly smells. Some nobles even commissioned perfumers to craft personalized scents. Rose water, ambergris, civet, yep, that comes from animals too, and musk. These weren't applied sparingly. You doused yourself, bathed in it. Because showering? Not happening. Scent had to do the heavy lifting. You pass by a wealthy couple now, her face powdered into oblivion, his beard combed and oiled, both of them radiating wealth and possibly toxic fumes. They're not smiling. Smiling wasn't fashionable. A still, solemn face conveyed dignity and restraint. Happiness? That was for festivals and peasants. And if this all sounds exhausting, to us, maintaining beauty in the Middle Ages wasn't just a personal routine. It was a social performance. You were judged by your family, your neighbors, your rivals, and occasionally your priest. Looking too good could be seen as vanity. Looking too plain could suggest you didn't respect your station. It was a tightrope act in head-to-toe velvet, balancing lead makeup and a forehead you'd just shaved 15 minutes ago. And yet, despite all the risks, the expense, the sheer absurdity of it all, it worked. In the glow of candlelight, with the right veil, the right powder, and the right sultry look from beneath downcast lashes, medieval beauty could be breathtaking. Ethereal. Otherworldly. You realize now that all of it, the poison makeup, the shaved eyebrows, the ridiculous codpieces and polaines, is part of the same story. A story where fashion wasn't just fabric. It was identity. And if you think that's weird, just wait till we talk about gloves so sacred you couldn't touch them, or how a single fur trim could tell you someone's marital status. But first, maybe take a step away from that powder box. It's still open, and you're starting to feel a little dizzy. You're still blinking the imaginary lead dust out of your eyes when you notice something odd. Someone just handed someone else a glove. No explanation. No speech. Just a single glove, passed gently, like a secret. And the reaction? Immediate. A murmur from nearby onlookers. One woman clutches her pearls, figuratively, because actual pearls were wildly expensive, and a man nearby frowns so deeply it might leave a wrinkle in time. You just witnessed a silent declaration of war. Because in the medieval world, gloves were never just gloves. They were power, pledge, romance, and rage, all stitched into one dainty little hand covering. See, a glove wasn't just an accessory to keep your noble fingers warm. It was symbolic language in leather. Knights would toss one to issue a challenge. Ladies would offer one as a token of affection. Lords would present them during ceremonies as signs of favor or command. If a noble handed you a glove and you didn't take it seriously, congratulations, you've just insulted half the court. And God forbid you dropped a glove. Dropping a glove in the wrong context could signal submission, disapproval, flirtation, or just clumsiness, but no one would assume the latter. Medieval folks were trained to read gestures like modern people read emojis, except these emojis could lead to exile. That glove you just saw handed off? It was probably an act of defiance. A subtle "we're done here" spoken entirely in goatskin. Gloves had power precisely because of how personal they were. They touched skin. They carried scent. They were worn tight enough to hold your fingerprints. And if gloves were for messaging, belts were all about storytelling. Not just fashion belts, these weren't keeping your jeans up. Medieval belts were full-on body art. They marked status, profession, relationship, even emotional state. That woman over there with the ornate belt hanging low on her hips? Likely married. That other one with a thinner, cinched band at her waist? Possibly unmarried, or at least hoping to appear so. Some belts were so long, they wrapped around the waist twice, the loose end dangling down like a ribbon of intention. And for knights, belts weren't just about holding a sword. They represented chivalric virtue. Some even took vows while girding themselves with ceremonial belts. To loosen another person's belt without permission? Not only rude, it could be legally scandalous. You catch sight now of a noblewoman entering a small church. She pauses to remove her gloves, not with haste, but with ritual. One finger at a time. Then she folds them gently and places them on a pew. This wasn't vanity. This was etiquette. Gloves were rarely worn during meals, religious services, or when touching sacred objects. Your hands were your true self. Your gloves? The mask. But even when not worn, gloves were valuable. People bequeathed gloves in their wills. Monarchs gave them as diplomatic gifts. One king famously paid a glove maker more for embroidery than for an entire suit of armor. And some gloves were perfumed, stitched with silk and gold, made to be admired more than used. This obsession wasn't limited to the rich either. Even among the working class, belts and gloves held meaning. A leather worker might mark his belt with his guild's emblem. A bride might embroider her husband's gloves with blessings for safe return. The objects themselves weren't valuable, but the message was priceless. You pass a group of young courtiers, their belts gleaming with tiny metal fittings, dangling charms, and pouches tied like little secrets. Purses weren't pockets, they were the pockets. Hanging at the hip, jangling as you walked, carrying tokens, love letters, coins, herbs. One girl fiddles with a little ivory comb hanging from hers, likely for show more than use. That's another thing. Fashion noise was very real. The soft clink of metal belt fittings, the jingle of bell-tipped gloves, the rustle of silk, all of it said, I am here. I am important. I have things. Your walk wasn't silent. It was a symphony of status. Even how you walked mattered. Straight posture, measured pace, arms close to the sides. Men moved with deliberate strength. Women with controlled elegance. Too fast? You're uncultured. Too slow? You're lazy. Too casual? Clearly not nobility. And then there's sitting. Yes, sitting had rules. For women, crossing ankles was acceptable. Crossing legs? Scandalous. For men, leaning too much to one side was seen as foppish. Elbows on the table? Only if you were discussing war tactics or reciting poetry. Even how you adjusted your belt when seated could send a signal. Loosening it slightly suggested comfort and control. Leaving it tight? Formal. Reserved. Possibly stressed. Body language was half the outfit. The way you removed a glove. The way you held your belt. The angle of your chin. The way you looked away while adjusting your sleeve. It was all carefully studied, especially in courts, where a raised eyebrow could ruin someone's week. Historians still argue over just how much people performed in daily life. Some believe only the nobility practiced this level of refinement. Others argue even villagers mimicked gestures and clothing cues whenever they got the chance, because everyone wanted to look like someone more powerful. And you know what? They still do. That influencer adjusting her designer watch just so? That executive unbuttoning his jacket as he walks into the room? That's the modern version of loosening your ceremonial belt to show you're in control. Some things don't change, they just come with better stitching. You look around again at all these gloved hands, cinched waists, and quiet statements worn like armor, and it hits you. Nobody ever really dressed just for themselves. Not then. Not now. And the next time someone hands you a glove, maybe think twice before you laugh. You're mid-step through a cobblestone alley, still thinking about glove-based duels and belt messages, When you spot something truly regal, no, imperial, crossing the square ahead. It's a man, draped in a cloak so heavy, so layered, and trimmed with what looks suspiciously like animal fur that could have come from a fantasy novel. He's not just walking, he's gliding. Children stop. Women whisper. Even the pigeons seem to pause. Then it hits you. You're not just looking at fashion. You're looking at legal power, wealth, and centuries of jealousy sewn into a hem. Because in the Middle Ages, clothes didn't just suggest your social status, they legally enforced it. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws. Elaborate, extremely petty, often hilarious rules about who could wear what, when, and how fabulously. That fur trim? Probably ermine. Reserved for royalty, or maybe the highest-ranking nobles. Only for people who owned land worth more than you'll ever see in gold coins. Squirrel fur? Surprisingly popular, and just about the only fur commoners could legally wear, if they were lucky. It even had a fancy name, ver. Sound familiar? That's where Cinderella's glass slipper mix-up came from. Ver, not ver. French is tricky like that. You'd better believe the monarchs took this seriously. If a butcher wore too fine a belt buckle? Fine. If a merchant dared to put silk lining in his coat? Fined again. If a wealthy widow tried to wear a dress that looked too similar to a duchess's outfit? She might have to burn it. Fashion wasn't just about taste, it was tightly controlled territory. For what? Why so many rules? Because envy and power. If everyone looked the same, how would you know who to bow to? Who to fear? Who to marry off your daughter to? The ruling classes needed visible proof that they were superior, and nothing proves superiority faster than denying everyone else access to the good stuff. That cloak you admired? It's probably woven with silk thread from Byzantium, possibly dyed with Tyrian purple, which literally came from crushed sea snails and cost more than gold. And guess what? Tyrian purple was illegal for almost everyone except royalty. If you wore it without permission, you might be fined, imprisoned, or have your clothes seized and destroyed. Imagine losing your entire wardrobe to a fashion police raid. You walk further and see a group of townsfolk dressed much more plainly, earth tones, homespun wool, maybe a touch of faded blue or brown from plant-based dyes. Nothing shiny. Nothing excessive. Not because they lack taste, but because they're not allowed. Even fabric width was restricted. That's right, certain classes were forbidden from wearing garments wider than a certain number of ells, an old unit of length. To what? Too rich-looking. Not allowed. Some garments had literal measurement limits, like skirts or sleeve lengths. Yes, fashion tape measures existed. No, nobody enjoyed being on the wrong end of one. And here's the kicker, these laws were often ignored. Because human nature. If you were rich but not noble, you wanted to look noble. So you smuggled in Italian silk, bribed a tailor, dyed your tunic just a little too deep a red. And if you got caught? Pay the fine. Then do it again next year. Some towns even had repeat offender tailors, basically fashion black market dealers in doublets and forbidden embroidery. Fashion, in that sense, was rebellion. Quiet, silky, rebellion. But not all rules were purely about oppression. Some were weirdly specific. In Florence, unmarried women couldn't wear pearls. In England, only knights and above could wear spurs made of gold or silver. In France, laws attempted to regulate the color of wedding dresses. Spoiler alert, they weren't always white. That tradition came much later. Medieval brides often wore blue, symbolizing purity and the Virgin Mary. Even headwear wasn't safe. Certain types of veils or hats were reserved for widows, nuns, or married women. Wearing the wrong one? Social chaos. Imagine showing up to your medieval version of brunch in a hat that says, "My husband just died," when you're actually engaged. Awkward. And here's where it gets complicated. Sometimes, fashion outpaced the law. Trends traveled fast, faster than messengers on horseback. And by the time a town enacted a rule against a specific sleeve shape, fashion had moved on to something even more absurd. The law was always a few embroidery stitches behind. You glance again at a group of young noblemen. Their tunics are edged in black sable, their hose richly dyed, their shoes tastefully pointed. They know exactly what they're doing. Every piece of their outfit has been calibrated to push just hard enough against the boundary of legality to show status without triggering a fine. And across the street? A woman in what seems like an ordinary brown gown. But look closely. That trim? Possibly illegal gold thread. The hem? Longer than her income bracket would suggest. She's no rebel. She's just playing the game. Everyone is. Historians still debate how strictly these laws were enforced. Some cities were rigorous, others relaxed. Some years saw dozens of arrests. Others? Nothing. It often came down to who you knew. A merchant with connections might get away with brocade. A tailor with the wrong friends might lose everything for crafting a pair of satin sleeves. But one thing is certain, people always found a way. They layered illegal fabrics under legal ones. Wore forbidden furs as lining. Commissioned illusion fabrics, cheaper cloth made to look expensive. And they took immense pride in walking the line between acceptable and exceptional. You watch now as a young girl runs past in a hand-me-down dress with carefully re-dyed sleeves and mismatched buttons. She might not know it, but she's part of a centuries-old tradition, the quiet revolution of everyday fashion. The idea that what you wear can say something about who you are, even if the law insists it shouldn't. And you start to understand why everyone here is so particular about their clothes. Because in this world, cloth is language. A gold-stitched hem? A sentence. A squirrel fur cuff? A paragraph. A dress too long? A full manifesto. And like all languages, some people speak it fluently. You step into the shadow of a cloister, cool stone walls, flickering candlelight, the faint scent of old incense and damp vellum, and for a moment, the fashion circus outside feels like another world. Here, there are no shiny polaines, no fluttering trains, no velvet tantrums. Just silence, solemnity, and a very particular kind of robe. Because if you thought fashion didn't matter inside religious life, think again. In medieval Europe, religious clothing was its own battleground. You glance at a row of monks filing into the chapel, their robes moving like a single dark tide. At first glance, they seem identical. Simple. Humble. That was the point. Religious garments were supposed to represent poverty, purity, and humility. But in reality, the rules around what monks and nuns could wear were just as strict, and sometimes just as petty, as those outside the abbey walls. Let's start with the monks. Most are wearing wool. Coarse, undyed, and deeply uncomfortable. That wasn't a design flaw, it was a virtue. The idea was to punish the flesh, reject earthly pleasures, and remind yourself, constantly, that you were not of this world. It's hard to feel sinful when you're itching like mad and your robe smells faintly of wet sheep. But not all monks wore the same thing. Benedictines, for example, wore black robes, hence their nickname, black monks. Cistercians? White wool. Franciscans? Brown or gray, with a rope belt called a cincture. The color and cut of your robe declared your order, your vows, and sometimes even your theological opinions. Yes, fashion debates got doctrinal. And these debates could get heated. In the 12th century, some reformist monks insisted on rougher fabrics and looser fits, claiming anything else was too luxurious. Others argued that a tighter belt helped with discipline. And yes, this led to real arguments about whether using a buckle on your belt was spiritually dangerous. Imagine eternal damnation because you chose the wrong clasp. Even the number of folds in a robe could matter. Too many and it was vain. Too few and it didn't drape properly. Monks often traveled with sewing needles tucked into their belts, not for decoration, but to personally maintain the simplicity of their garments. And then there were shoes, or the lack thereof. Some monks went completely barefoot. Others wore sandals, often without socks, through snow and mud alike. Austerity didn't care about frostbite. But some orders permitted simple shoes, as long as they weren't dyed or decorated. Just imagine arguing whether a single stitch of color counted as decoration or reinforcement. Medieval councils did. Nuns weren't spared either. Their habits followed strict rules. Like monks, the color and fabric depended on the order. Black for Benedictines, white for Cistercians, gray or brown for Poor Clares. Head coverings were mandatory and often included multiple layers. a coif, a wimple, a veil. Getting dressed was a spiritual ritual in itself. But even within these rules, there were subtle hierarchies. The abbess might have a slightly different cut of sleeve, a more finely woven scapular, and sometimes, if the convent was wealthy enough, nuns would wear habits made from expensive fabric, just dyed to look plain. There's that quiet fashion rebellion again. You move deeper into the chapel and see a richly robed bishop preparing for Massachusetts. And this is where things get theatrical, because clergy vestments were a whole other universe. Gold thread, embroidered stoles, bejeweled mitres, those tall pointy hats. Layer upon layer of sacred fabrics, each with its own symbolic meaning. Alb, the white robe worn underneath, symbolizing purity. Chasuble, the outermost garment, often in elaborate colors depending on the feast day. Stole, draped over the shoulders, a mark of priestly authority. Amice, a square of cloth around the neck, like a divine bib of humility. And then there's the cope, a massive semicircular cloak worn for processions and ceremonies. Some were so large and so heavy with gold thread, it took multiple attendants just to carry them properly. They shimmered in candlelight, a slow-motion miracle of embroidery. To the average medieval layperson, these robes weren't just impressive, they were divine. The wealth poured into a bishop's vestments reflected the glory of God, or at least, that was the justification. Critics, however, were not convinced. Reformers railed against what they saw as excess. Why should a man of God dress like a king? They asked. But the church had a counterargument. We are dressing for a king. And this tension, between humble devotion and heavenly opulence, shaped centuries of religious fashion. You pass a statue now, carved into the chapel wall. It shows a monk kneeling in prayer, hood pulled low, hands clasped. You notice the folds in his robe, simple, yes, but still artful, still intentional. And you realize, even here, in the most austere corners of medieval life, fashion wasn't absent. It was just spiritualized. There were rules. There were exceptions. There were scandals. There was, believe it or not, a nun excommunicated for wearing silk. Most historians agree it wasn't the silk alone. But it didn't help. Because even when you give up the world, you still live in it. And clothes, blessed, stitched, and scandalous, were part of that world. You step back out into the sun now, blinking at the glare. And suddenly, those ridiculous hats and codpieces don't seem so strange anymore. They were just a different kind of vestment. And everyone, from prince to pilgrim, was always dressed for something. You're barely back into the bustling streets before something else catches your eye, a procession. Not a royal one. Not religious either. This one is personal. There's a bride walking slowly between two women, her veil fluttering like a nervous breath, her gown radiant and long, the train just barely escaping the mud with the help of a servant. She's surrounded by curious onlookers, and every piece of her outfit is being judged harder than a baking competition in a royal court. Because medieval weddings weren't just about love. They were a stage. And her dress? Her armor? Forget white. That didn't become the standard until Queen Victoria centuries later. This bride is wearing blue, the color of the Virgin Mary, of purity, of loyalty, and also a very fashionable choice. If she's wealthy, it's a deep, vivid indigo made with expensive woad or imported dye. If not, it's probably a softer, plant-based blue that fades in the sun, but hey, still counts. Weddings were one of the rare moments where a woman could absolutely pull out all the stops. Velvet, silk, fur trim, jeweled belts, intricate embroidery. This wasn't just about looking good, it was about proving her family's worth. The more extravagant the outfit, the louder the statement. We have alliances, money, honor, and look, she even has sleeves that touch the floor. The sleeves. Let's talk about those. In medieval times, sleeves were practically their own drama series. Especially for brides. A noblewoman might wear sleeves so long they trailed behind her, sewn on just for the ceremony and then removed for practicality later. Some even tied detachable sleeves with ribbons or laces, which later became tokens, gifts exchanged between lovers or family members. And if a marriage broke off? A woman might literally send back the sleeves she'd been given. Imagine getting ghosted by UPS delivery of your ex-fiancé's silk arm coverings. But not all weddings were joyful affairs. Some were political negotiations, hastily arranged for property, land, or peace treaties. The couple might not even meet until the ceremony, and their outfits could still be coordinated, colors matching, family crests sewn discreetly into hems, veils trimmed to mirror each other's cloaks. It looked romantic. It wasn't always. Even peasant weddings had style rules. You couldn't just show up in any old tunic. Many villages had traditions around color, fabric, and borrowed garments. Yes, something borrowed was already a thing. A girl might wear her mother's girdle or a friend's necklace. If a woman wore a red ribbon in her hair, it might mean she was already betrothed, even if the ring hadn't been exchanged yet. And speaking of rings, they weren't always part of the ceremony. When they were, they might be plain bands of iron or elaborately worked gold, sometimes engraved with religious phrases or personal mottos. One popular design? The posy ring, with a poem inscribed inside. Romantic. Occasionally passive-aggressive. But now, as the wedding procession passes, something darker comes into view. A group of women in black. Veils down. Eyes lowered. You're looking at a medieval mourning party. In stark contrast to the wedding garments, these clothes are rigidly simple, but still deeply meaningful. Mourning dress followed strict customs, and wearing the wrong thing at the wrong time could be seen as disrespectful or even suspicious. For noble women, black was the default. But dyeing fabric that dark was expensive, and most people couldn't afford it. So poorer mourners might wear gray or brown, and some just turned their clothes inside out, or added strips of black cloth to their sleeves or collars. And there were timelines. Rules. You didn't just wear black until you felt better. There were defined periods of grief, from deep mourning to half mourning, where certain colors like dark purple or muted blue were allowed again. Think of it like fashion grief stages, each one a little closer to letting go. Some widows chose to wear black for life. Others only wore it for months. And if they remarried too quickly or too colorfully, it would be noticed. Fashion was grief's translator. You see it now in the way a woman's veil shakes slightly as she walks. It's not just fabric, it's a shield. A message. A weight. That lace trim? Maybe from her late husband's shirt. That ring on her chain? A relic. An anchor. Even children were sometimes dressed in miniature mourning outfits. And entire noble households might be required to don black to honor a deceased lord. In certain courts, you couldn't appear in public without some visible sign of grief, not until the proper time had passed. It was more than tradition. It was etiquette. And etiquette was a minefield. The same sleeve that made a bride radiant could mark a widow's sorrow just months later. The same blue that symbolized love might be forbidden during mourning. The same veil that covered a virgin's modesty might be repurposed to shield tears. There's something tragic and beautiful about it. This idea that clothes could carry emotions when words fell short. You wonder now how many of those dramatic hats, gleaming belts, and finely embroidered gloves you've seen today were once part of a wedding or a funeral. Passed down, resewn, tucked away until needed again. Medieval people didn't waste cloth. They reused it, redyed it, reshaped it into something new, layered with memory. And somewhere, deep in a wooden chest beneath a noblewoman's bed, might rest a pair of sleeves tied with a faded red ribbon. A promise made. A story half told. You turn a corner into what seems like just another market square, vendors shouting, chickens protesting, the scent of cheese and wood smoke battling it out in the air, and then you hear it. Guess. A shriek. And then laughter. Lots of it. A man is being dragged away by town guards. His crime? Wearing the wrong hat. No, seriously. That feathered cap he's clutching in protest? Apparently it's reserved for men of higher rank, or, in this town, strictly for ceremonial occasions. He's just a baker. His hat? Illegal swagger. The guards aren't angry, exactly. Just firm. Like fashion referees enforcing a very serious and very deeply medieval dress code. Welcome to the world of fashion scandals. Where clothes weren't just about beauty or status, but about laws, gender, and moral panic. Because here's a not-so-fun fact. In the Middle Ages, wearing the wrong kind of clothing could get you fined, imprisoned, excommunicated, or humiliated. Sometimes all four. And nothing stirred up scandal like cross-dressing. You see, gender in medieval Europe wasn't just an identity, it was a uniform. Strictly enforced, publicly visible, and loaded with theological baggage. If you were born a woman, you wore long skirts, covered hair, and soft colors. If you were a man, you wore tunics, hose, and enough weapon-shaped accessories to prove it. So when someone blurred that line, all hell broke loose. Take Joan of Arc, revered now, burned then. Among her many heresies, wearing men's armor was one of the charges that helped get her executed. Even though she was leading armies, even though it was practical and necessary, the court decided her pants were just too scandalous. And she wasn't alone. There are multiple medieval court records, spanning England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, where people were arrested or punished for wearing the wrong clothing. In some cases, it was for safety. In others, disguise. But to the authorities, it was always suspicious. Cross-dressing laws weren't just about morality, they were about control. The church taught that clothing was tied to divine order. Mess with that, and you might as well be challenging God's entire wardrobe plan. A man in a dress wasn't just confusing. He was dangerous. And yet, it happened. Often. Sometimes for theater, men routinely played female roles on stage. Sometimes for travel, women disguised as men to avoid harassment or move freely. And sometimes, just because. One noblewoman in Italy allegedly dressed in men's armor and rode out with a hunting party for years. Some chronicles admired her. Others? Less so. Scandal also came in wardrobe malfunctions. Picture it, a young squire at court, proud as a peacock, shows up to a tournament in hose so tight, they split while he's bowing to a duchess. Guess. Laughter. Reputation? Ruined. One English poet even wrote of a man whose codpiece burst open mid-dance, revealing more than just poor tailoring. And then there's the too much fashion scandal. In 14th century France, there was public outcry over noblemen wearing corsets. Yes, men's corsets. Designed to shape the waist and support posture under armor, but worn with such vanity that critics called them instruments of Satan's pride. One preacher declared they squeezed the soul as tightly as the ribs. Women weren't immune either. If a noblewoman wore a neckline too low, especially in church, it could spark a sermon, or a pamphlet, or a full-on moral panic. Even in an era where some dresses deliberately revealed the sides of the bust, the so-called side-boob gowns, there were limits. And stepping over them meant instant scandal. Let's not forget the hat wars. You laugh, but it was serious business. Certain hats, especially in cities like Florence or Bruges, were deeply symbolic. A wide-brimmed hat could mark a merchant guild. A feathered cap might denote court service. Wearing one without the right affiliation? Like sneaking into a VIP lounge with a fake pass. There were actual laws about hats. And the biggest offender of all? The tall hennin, that iconic cone-shaped hat worn by noblewomen, often with a veil streaming down like a bridal flag. When those first appeared in Burgundy, people lost their minds. Preachers called them towers of vanity. Artists mocked them in satirical drawings. Some towns tried to ban them outright, declaring them horns of the devil disguised in silk. Naturally, everyone wanted one. It's funny, isn't it? For all their talk of modesty and order, medieval people loved a little chaos. They thrived on what wasn't allowed, on testing the limits of lace, on pushing hems and hat heights just past decency. Because scandal was a kind of power. And the greatest irony? Most of the laws didn't work. They were too hard to enforce. Too easy to skirt, pun fully intended. And most towns simply didn't have the energy to punish every tailor with a wild idea. So the rules remained, but the people? They kept pushing. Because what's fashion, if not a quiet little rebellion sewn one button too low? You walk past the crowd again and the baker, the one with the forbidden hat, is being let go. He's grinning now. Someone even claps him on the back. Maybe he'll pay a fine. Maybe he won't. But you can tell he's earned something else. A story. And in this town? that might be worth more than the hat ever was. You've seen enough glorified sleeves and scandalous shoes to know medieval fashion was never just about looking good, it was a performance. But here's the question, what did people wear when no one was watching? Well, you're about to find out. Because tonight, you're not slipping into a grand hall or bustling market. You're sneaking into the places where even noble courtiers let down their veils, where lords remove their jeweled belts, and knights, yes, even them, start to complain about their aching feet. Welcome to the medieval bedroom. Let's start with sleepwear. Contrary to what you might imagine, medieval people didn't tumble into bed wearing full tunics and belts. Most wore nightshirts, long, loose, often linen garments that reached to the knees or ankles. White or undyed, they were breathable, easy to wash, a big plus in the days before laundry detergent, and a little more stylish than they probably needed to be. Because, of course, even sleep had its aesthetics. And yes, both men and women wore nightshirts. Sometimes the same one for several days. And sometimes none at all. That's right. Sleeping naked wasn't unheard of, especially among the poor who couldn't afford a second set of clothes just for dreaming. But for the upper class? Oh, sleepwear got fancy. Some wealthy nobles had special bedrobes, silk or fine wool wraps meant only for lounging before bed or receiving visitors in the bedchamber. Picture a medieval version of a kimono crossed with a status update. If someone came to visit you late at night, you better believe you needed to be wrapped in something that whispered, "I'm wealthy even when I'm drowsy." Then there were nightcaps, not the alcoholic kind, though let's be honest, those were common too, but literal cloth caps worn to bed. They weren't fashion statements. They were functional. Drafty stone castles didn't exactly trap heat, and a linen cap helped prevent losing body warmth from your head. Think of it as a medieval beanie. Cozy, stylish, let's say, questionably charming. You wander now through the quarters of a knight, and you catch sight of his armor, carefully hung, polished, with the precision of a man who knows both war and vanity. Because here's the thing. Armor wasn't just protection. It was fashion. Medieval plate armor wasn't some one-size-fits-all tin suit. It was custom-made, engraved, sometimes gilded, even jewel-encrusted. A 15th-century noble might stride into battle with a helmet so shiny it practically reflected the carnage around him. And tournaments? Well, friend, that was catwalk meets bloodsport. Knights would wear parade armor, beautiful, elaborate, often impractical sets crafted not for combat, but for show. Plumed helms, embossed breastplates, colored enamel, etched designs of saints or family crests. It was more red carpet than battlefield. One duke reportedly spent the modern equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars on a suit of ceremonial armor he never even fought in. Because when you showed up to a tournament looking like a walking sculpture of divine authority, people noticed. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. Even the undergarments worn beneath armor were status symbols. Padded gambesons, quilted jackets for protection, hose reinforced at the knees, linen brays, like boxer shorts, but less breathable, all were made to be hidden, but commissioned with care. Because if someone helped you dress, and they often did, they saw everything. Including your sense of style. And what about lords and ladies at home? Once the doors closed and servants withdrew, clothing shifted again. Corsets came off. Hair came down, literally. Ladies often wore linen underveils at home, or left their hair braided loosely. Men might swap formal tunics for indoor doublets. Lighter, simpler, but still elegant. This was the domain of comfort fashion, where soft fabrics replaced velvet, and family-only silks replaced state occasion satins. Robes lined with fur. Embroidered slippers. Woolen socks held up by ribbon garters. Even at rest, these people didn't fully dress down. They simply recalibrated their style for a smaller audience. And here's where it gets delightfully weird. Some nobles had fashion for bathing. Yes, bathing. Public bathhouses weren't uncommon, and for the wealthy, bath time was a whole ritual. Scented oils, rose petals, perfumed towels, and robes worn just for stepping in and out of the bath. One noblewoman even commissioned a fur-trimmed towel robe, because apparently nothing says clean like squirrel fur and damp stone. Oh, and did you think pajamas were exempt from gossip? Not a chance. If a noble was caught entertaining guests in their night robe, it would be noted. Was the robe silk or just linen? Were the sleeves properly hemmed? Did they wear hose beneath, or, scandal, bare legs? Even in half-light, fashion didn't sleep. You glance now at a young page boy curling up on a straw mattress near the hearth, wearing a patched nightshirt that's 2 sizes too big. It was probably handed down from someone wealthier. Maybe it's got a family crest sewn inside the collar. Maybe not. But it's still a story. Still part of the fabric of medieval life. Woven, worn, and passed on. And just before the candles are snuffed out, you catch one more glimpse of that noblewoman from earlier, hair braided, veil off, slipping into a night robe the color of faded lavender. She turns just slightly and smiles. Because even here, in the quiet folds of the night, fashion still matters. You awaken to the sound of small feet pattering across stone floors, a rhythm somewhere between a scamper and a proclamation. You follow the sound, half amused, half curious, until you step into a sun-drenched hall where a parade of children is being wrangled into submission by 3 nurses, one very tired-looking governess, and a surprisingly stern seamstress. Welcome to the wild, unpredictable, and occasionally ridiculous world of medieval children's fashion. And right away, you notice something odd. These kids don't look like kids. They look like miniature adults. That's because in medieval Europe, childhood wasn't its own world the way it is now. There were no dinosaur pajamas, no cartoon-themed socks, no back-to-school sales. Instead, children, especially noble children, were dressed to reflect their family's rank, wealth, and political ambition. In other words, they wore what you wore, just smaller and more complicated to clean. Let's start with the basics. Most babies were wrapped in swaddling bands, long strips of cloth wound tightly around the limbs and torso, keeping the baby straight and immobile. The belief was that it helped bones grow correctly. Modern science disagrees, but in the Middle Ages, if your baby wasn't wrapped like a wool burrito, you were considered negligent. Once out of swaddling, toddlers were often dressed in long gowns, regardless of gender. That's right, tiny boys in dresses. But convenience. Long gowns made diaper access easier. Plus, young boys and girls weren't seen as fundamentally different until about age 7, when boys might begin formal training and girls might be groomed for marriage negotiations, casual stuff. Around that age, the distinctions began. Boys were slowly shifted into tunics and hose. Girls were taught to manage veils, underdresses, and eventually corset-laced bodices, sometimes before they could read. And if you were a noble child, every stitch had meaning. That little girl in the corner with the velvet sleeves? She's probably betrothed already. That tunic the boy's wearing with the red griffin? It's his father's house sigil. That tiny gold circlet on the toddler's head? Not a toy. A literal symbol of dynastic power. Because children were walking political pawns, especially among royalty. If you dressed your child in the crest of your ally, it was a message. If you sent them to court in dull colors, it might imply mourning or withdrawal. If your daughter arrived at a feast with bare arms, that could be read as scandalous or seductive, depending on the tone of the embroidery. And there was a deeper logic. If children looked noble, they would be treated nobly. In a world where arranged marriages could happen before age 10, where hostages were taken for political leverage, and where a single rumor could upend inheritance laws, fashion became armor, even if it was worn by someone who still struggled with their shoelaces. Now, not every child was dripping in silk and symbolism. Peasant children wore simple tunics, sometimes second-hand, often homemade. Materials were practical: wool in the winter, linen in the summer. Clothes were often a size too large, designed to last years, not months. And no, there were no baby socks. Children simply learned to keep their shoes on or went barefoot. Still, fashion filtered down. A village girl might copy the veil of a noblewoman using dyed scraps. A young farm boy might mimic a squire's belt with a piece of knotted rope. Aspiration was everywhere, even if it had to be stitched out of leftovers. And let's not forget the accessories. Medieval children, especially of noble birth, were often loaded with charms, talismans, and amulets. A small silver cross for protection. a coral branch pinned to the tunic to ward off evil spirits, a pouch tied to a belt containing dried herbs, or a lock of a parent's hair. These weren't just spiritual, they were also social. Look, these tokens said, someone loves this child enough to protect them. But all of this, the tiny crowns, the velvet cloaks, the miniature belts, came with a price. Children hated it. Accounts from the time hint at frequent tantrums during dressing. One noble boy reportedly refused to attend a feast because his hose itched like ants and shame. A young heiress cried for 2 hours when her governess tried to braid her hair into the style of her betrothed's household. Fashion was not a choice. It was identity enforced. Even footwear caused drama. Noble children often wore pointed shoes just like their parents, sometimes too pointed to walk properly. One popular anecdote tells of a boy who tripped at court and accidentally insulted a bishop by landing on his mitre. The shoes were blamed. The bishop was not amused. And then, of course, there were portraits. Wealthy families commissioned paintings of their children to show off to future in-laws, rivals, and the occasional monastery. In these images, you'll see 4-year-olds in brocade coats, toddlers with tiny jeweled hats, and infants holding symbolic objects, scepters, prayer books, even miniature falcons. Realism was not the goal. Legacy was. Historians still debate how much agency children had over their clothing. Some believe noble girls occasionally refused certain gowns as acts of defiance. Others argue that choices were so restricted, kids didn't even think about rebellion until they reached adolescence, when fashion, naturally, became a new battlefield. And what about hand-me-downs? They were common, especially in large households. But even those came with hierarchy. A gown worn by an older sister might be passed down to the next daughter, with the sleeves trimmed shorter, the color faded, and the embroidery updated to reflect new political alliances. In one case, a noble girl wore a wedding dress originally tailored for her aunt, who had run away with a monk. Scandal aside, fabric was expensive. Now, as you watch a nurse finally wrestle a velvet cap onto a squirming toddler, you understand something important. Medieval children weren't just growing into their roles. They were trained to wear their futures. Their sleeves held promises. Their tunics bore history. Their shoes, if they stayed on, walked the path of expectation. And though some garments were stiff with symbolism, others were soft with love, stitched by mothers, adjusted by nannies, preserved by hopeful hands. Because even in a world of war and inheritance, someone always cared enough to make sure the smallest ones were dressed for the part. The wind picks up, and suddenly you're reminded that for all the drama of velvet and jewels, medieval Europe was not exactly known for its central heating. You wrap your cloak tighter and glance around. The townsfolk seem utterly unfazed. A woman adjusts her wimple against the breeze. A merchant layers a short-sleeved surcoat over a long wool tunic. A small boy trudges by with sleeves that double as mittens. And it dawns on you, medieval fashion had seasons. They didn't just wear what looked good, they dressed for weather, time of year, and regional climate, all while navigating sumptuary laws and social expectations. It was like trying to layer up for winter while still impressing the in-laws and the archbishop at the same time. Let's start with winter. Medieval winters could be brutally cold, especially in northern Europe. Homes were drafty, fireplaces were reserved for the privileged or communal halls, and insulation was, at best, theoretical. Clothing became armor against the cold. Wool was the main defense. Thick, layered, and often felted for extra warmth, it was the workhorse of winter fashion. Undergarments were made of linen, but everything else? Wool tunics, wool cloaks, wool hose, sometimes even wool hoods with built-in capes, like a fantasy character going out to buy onions. Fur made frequent appearances too, but remember, it was highly regulated. Nobility wore squirrel, ermine, fox, and marten. The less fortunate might sew rabbit fur into lining or cuffs, if they could get it. Fur was often hidden inside clothing for warmth and modesty, except for nobles, who proudly turned it outward to say, "Look what I killed for comfort." And then there were layered sleeves. Yes, sleeves again. They weren't just fashionable, they were practical. Some gowns had detachable sleeves that could be swapped out depending on the weather. A sort of modular wardrobe, medieval style. You might even see people with hand warmers, small pouches of fabric stuffed with hot stones or coals. Yes, fire. Near fabric. What could possibly go wrong? Now contrast that with summer. You might think people would toss the layers, go sleeveless, and finally air out those hose. But not quite. Medieval summer wear was still modest. Bare arms and legs were scandalous in most settings. Instead, people adjusted their fabrics. Linen became the fabric of choice, lightweight, breathable, and relatively easy to clean, by medieval standards, which is to say, possible. Wealthier folks might even wear fine cotton or imported silk, though those were rare and expensive. Instead of ditching the layers, they often reduced the weight. A noblewoman might wear a sheer chemise under a loosely belted summer gown. A merchant might roll up his sleeves or wear an open-sided surcoat for airflow. But full undress? Still frowned upon, unless you were farming, bathing, or just didn't care what the church thought. Hats changed too. Wide-brimmed straw hats or simple linen coifs were common to block the sun. And parasols, yes, medieval parasols, existed for the rich, usually held by a servant, because heaven forbid a noble had to hold their own shade. But summer wasn't all breezy tunics and floral embroidery. It was also when people sweated. A lot. So fashion came with scent solutions. Perfumed sachets, dried lavender sewn into clothes, rosewater hand wash. Fashion met hygiene in subtle ways. You might not have deodorant, but you did have a rosemary sprig tucked into your girdle. Stylish and aromatic. Then came rain. Rain was a disaster. There were no umbrellas. Cloaks were the primary defense, especially hooded cloaks with waxed or oiled outer layers. Some were lined with fur for warmth, others with wool. Rich folk might carry a heavy embroidered cloak in case of sudden showers. Basically, a walking tent that doubled as a fashion statement. Footwear adapted too. People wore pattens, wooden or leather platforms that strapped over your regular shoes to keep them off the muddy streets. Think medieval flip-flops, but wooden and designed to make an absolute racket on stone. A noblewoman gliding through town in satin slippers? Cute idea, until she steps in horse dung. That's where patterns saved the day, and the hem. And yes, even fashion colors had seasons. Deep reds, browns, and forest greens were popular in fall and winter. Lighter blues, soft yellows, and floral embroidery showed up in spring and summer, particularly among the elite. Some courtly fashion followed the liturgical calendar, aligning with church feast days and holy seasons, because what better time to debut your new outfit than Pentecost? But here's the twist, fashion and practicality didn't always get along. You'd see men in hose so tight they lost circulation in winter. Women in heavy brocade gowns fainting in the summer heat. A bishop once tripped in the snow because his vestment train was too long and got caught under a horse. Medieval fashion was creative, expressive, but never perfectly convenient. Yet somehow they made it work. They layered. They adjusted. They embroidered seasonal symbolism into their clothing. Lambs in spring, vines in autumn, stars in winter. They treated fashion like a living thing, changing with the world around them. And they did all this without closets, without zippers, and with buttons that were still a luxury item. Now, as you pull your own cloak tighter against the breeze, you look around with new eyes. That woman's scarf? Probably packed with herbs for summer flies. That man's fur-lined hood? Reversible, depending on the season. That child's belt? Re-knotted to fit over layers for winter. Fashion was never just fabric. It was survival. Celebration. Identity, stitched one season at a time. You're standing at the edge of the village now. The sun's dipping low, casting long shadows over cobbled paths and half-timbered walls. Somewhere, a bell tolls, soft, steady, final. And as the medieval world folds into twilight, you start to realize something. This journey through strange, spectacular, often ridiculous fashion wasn't just about the past. It's about how you're dressed right now. Because as outlandish as medieval fashion could be, pointy shoes, 10-foot sleeves, fur-lined everything, you're still living in its shadow. The way you match colors. The way you button your coat. The way you think of casual versus formal. All of it has roots planted in this world of rules, rebellion, and relentless creativity. Let's begin with something simple, the button. In the early Middle Ages, buttons were mostly decorative. Functional buttons didn't show up in Europe until the 13th century. But once they did, everything changed. Tailors could create tight-fitting sleeves, doublets, and bodices. Clothes started to hug the body, to move with it. Sound familiar? That body-hugging fashion you see today? The pencil skirts, the fitted blazers, the perfectly tapered jeans? It began with a medieval tailor discovering how to line up a row of buttons down a sleeve. Then there's the idea of seasonal trends. We still change our wardrobes with the weather. We still await the spring collection or the fall lookbook. Well, guess who did that first? Medieval nobles, swapping out summer silks for winter wools, dyeing clothes with seasonal colors, layering up or stripping down based on the calendar and the church's feast days. Sound like a department store schedule? Because it kind of was. And let's not forget gendered fashion. Blue for boys and pink for girls? That's modern. But gendered clothing? That's medieval to the bone. Those rules, skirts for women, hose for men, veils versus caps, were enforced with a seriousness that still echoes today. Every time someone side-eyes a guy in a crop top or questions a woman in a tuxedo, they're reenacting a debate that started 700 years ago. You glance down at your shoes, maybe they're laced, maybe slip-ons, maybe boots. But once upon a time, medieval folks spent hours debating the appropriate length of the toe on their shoes. People got fined for wearing points that were too long. One king even decreed that only men of rank could wear shoes with toes longer than 2 inches. Toes were regulated. It sounds absurd, but think about our own fashion rules. No white after Labor Day. Black is slimming. That dress is too short for work. That suit is too flashy for a funeral. You're still playing the game, they just changed the scoreboard. And what about identity? Today, your clothes say what music you like, what job you have, what values you carry. Medieval people did the same thing, with their hoods, their brooches, their fabrics and colors and crest embroidery. A woman with a scarlet hem might signal romance. A man with a wolf embroidered on his sleeve might be part of a family feud. Clothes weren't just garments. They were messages. We still wear our messages. You know those luxury labels stitched onto handbags or jackets? That's the same logic as a medieval noble having his tailor embroider the family coat of arms into a collar. Branding isn't modern. It's ancient. The only thing that changed was the font. And here's a secret. Fashion was never just decoration. It was rebellion. That servant who dared to wear silk when he wasn't allowed? He was making a statement. That woman who wore armor? She was claiming space. That monk who embroidered a secret pattern into his robe? Quiet resistance. Fashion was resistance, ritual, and ritualized rebellion. You might think you're living in a time far more free than theirs, and in many ways, you are. But next time you walk past a department store window, scroll past an influencer's outfit breakdown, or panic about what to wear on a date, remember, you're still in the medieval fashion cycle. Just with sneakers. So as you turn away from the fading town, the distant chime of bells still echoing, take one last look at this strange, layered, deeply human world. You've walked through battles and beds, scandals and stitches. You've worn velvet and wool and embarrassment. You've seen how even the smallest hem carried a legacy. And now you breathe out. The sounds of the medieval world soften. The silhouettes blur. The torches flicker one last time before fading into the velvet dark. Let it go. Let the noise drift away. Let the fabric fall silent. The laces are unfastened. The sleeves are folded. The world grows still. And your breath becomes the only thread left spinning. End of script. Sweet dreams.